I awoke to a city dank with a sense of heavy regret. I pulled on the clawing greyness around myself like a cloak, looking nowhere but downward, with a boding sense that the day was headed in a similar direction. Across town, a siren broke the muttering, pre-dawn quiet, slicing through the lingering dryness of last night's whiskey and bringing back memories of a night I'd rather forget. Breakfast should help, or would, if I didn't have to listen to my new partner regurgitate the rulebook.
He's late again. Of course he's late. And even though he's late, he won't have read the updates from forensics, let alone dealt with the red flag queries from HR. Then there's the case. I was up till 3 trying to keep us on the right side of the manual, but we're still missing things. Not that he cares. I could see the look he had at the crime scene, the look of someone that has skipped ahead to the last page of the book. But this case is about the evidence.
Those were 2 fictional detectives, D.I. Jake Bullitt, Maverick Cop, and D.S. Lara Sund, played by the Rules Cop, very ably voiced indeed on this occasion by my incredibly talented colleagues James Munro and Zoe Walkington. The partnership between the Maverick and rule-abiding cop is probably one that is very familiar to you, as it's a common theme in crime novels, films and TV series such as Life on Mars. Psychology has a great deal indeed to say about just how dangerous it is to be a maverick cop that conducts investigations based on intuition and hunches, and the problems and harms that this can lead to. But today, I want to focus on the harms that can arise even when the police stick to the rules. I'm Graham Pike, Professor of Forensic Cognition with the Open Psychology Research Centre here at the Open University. And I want to talk to you about my research on harmful evidence and evidencing harm in the criminal justice system. I say my research, but the work I'll be presenting was conducted by a number of research teams comprising academics from a wide variety of disciplines and also practitioners from law enforcement. You can see pictures of some of the people involved in these teams on the current slide, and apologies to anyone I missed out. It was just because I didn't have a picture of you to hand. Oh, and by the way, if you would like to find out more about D.I. Bullitt and D.S. Sund, they currently feature in 2 of our open access courses on the FutureLearn and OpenLearn platforms, and will also be appearing in a new course to be launched later in the year. My research crosses 2 of the strands of the Open Psychology Centre, those of forensic cognition and the psychology of health and well-being. The theme of the conference we're using to launch the new centre is Opening Psychology for Changing Times, which I see as particularly relevant to my research in both strands. I'm very keen to open psychology and always take a multidisciplinary approach to my research on the psychological issues in law enforcement, opening the discipline to fresh approaches from other academic perspectives and also from practitioners. I'm interested in changing times, particularly impact of new technologies and how these can enable us to take a new approach to old issues in law enforcement. Returning to the theme of opening psychology and a multidisciplinary approach to psychological issues in law enforcement, I've created a word cloud of all the different academic disciplines I'm currently collaborating with to look at law enforcement issues. Everything from software engineering, human-computer action, through to health and well-being and English literature. But it's criminology, particularly critical criminology, that I'd like to start off by having a look at. Now, the traditional way, perhaps, of seeing a crime, law enforcement, is that a crime is committed, the victim suffers as a result. The police and law enforcement then investigate the crime, it's tried in court, and if there's a conviction, then the person is sent to prison. So one of the issues with this is when we tend to think of crime, we tend to think of interpersonal crime, and very often we're talking about the crimes of the powerless and less privileged in society. So one thing critical criminology has done is to stop talking about crime and to start talking about harm. Now, it's very important to acknowledge that when we're talking about harm, the criminal will still cause harm to the victim, and I don't want to downplay that element of this process whatsoever. But thinking of harm, not crime, opens up a great deal more of that process to a fresh take and a new look. So thinking of harm, we can see that the police investigation itself can lead to harm. And this is really where my research focuses on, rather than the courts and the penal system. So we've seen that maverick cops, where they break the law and in fact would be committing a crime, can cause harm to the suspect. But even play by the rules cop can lead to harm to the suspect. They can lead harm to the victim. And that's indeed acknowledged that investigations can cause harm to the victim, because if a victim is vulnerable, then the police adopt a very different approach using different rooms, different personnel, and different procedures to elicit information and evidence from that person. The investigation can also cause harm to the witnesses. Some of the early research I did was looking at the impact of attending an eyewitness identification parade on a witness, and it caused them a great deal of stress, anxiety indeed. Now, the police acknowledge these harms and are keen to talk about them. At a conference with police recently talking about harm, one of the things they raised themselves was the potential harm to the environment that law enforcement can cause. They have a large estate and a large fleet, for instance, which will lead to a large carbon footprint. In addition, it's possible that the investigation and law enforcement can also harm the officers and staff that work for policing agencies. And one other element it can do is produce harmful evidence. So evidence that will lead to the wrong person being investigated, the wrong person going to court, and inevitably sometimes the wrong person, an innocent person, being sent to prison, which of course will certainly cause them a lot of harm. Harm can also occur at the court and penal elements of this process, but it really is law enforcement that I want to look at today, forgetting the idea of crime and instead looking at harm, a fresh look at the process using harm. So I want to start by evidencing harm. This idea that the investigation and being a member of law enforcement can cause harm to the officers and staff involved. And I did this through a project looking at the health and well-being of the emergency responder community. So not just law enforcement here, but police, ambulance, the voluntary sector, rescue as well. So this was research that was done jointly with the King's Centre for Military Health Research at King's College London. And it produced a report, the link of which is on the slide in front of you. It's a very comprehensive report indeed, and I do urge you to read it if you're interested in this area, because I'm unfortunately going to deal with this very large project in a single slide. So what we did to assess mental health and well-being of the emergency responder community was use systematic and landscape reviews, and those included interviews with 40 relevant emergency responder staff. Now, it's very hard to draw conclusions from existing research because research looking at health and well-being in this area is very varied. It's often looked at a particular sub-sample of a particular agency. Researchers used very different measures, sampling techniques, etc. So it's hard to generalize. But nonetheless, it does look like emergency responders, including law enforcement, are very likely to experience more mental health problems, such as anxiety and depression, than are the general population. There are also some worrying things that emerged in our landscape review, in that the support landscape at the moment is very vast and varied. It's very difficult to navigate, and there's some elements of a postcode lottery because a lot of the support is provided by charities which vary from geographic area to geographic area. It's also incumbent at the moment, the responsibility and accountability lie on the individual to identify that they have mental health issues and to reach out for help, which is obviously problematic. This is made more problematic as when they reach out within their own agency, it's their own line manager they need to speak to. And there's perceptions that there's stigma involved in doing so that could hurt that person's career. Perhaps the key finding from this research, though, was that although it is clear that there are mental health issues that can arise from attending investigations and getting involved in violent scenes, for example, it was organisational stressors that had a greater impact on the mental health and well-being of emergency responders rather than critical incident stressors. So by that, I mean things like shift work and the way people are managed and their workloads seem to lead to more mental health issues. And we found that culture was key. Many emergency responders attribute their poor mental health support to unsupportive managers. But the flip side of this is that where there's good, strong leadership and good organisational support, then mental health and well-being were improved. So now turning our attention to harmful evidence. So this is evidence that's obtained during police investigation, which leads essentially to the wrong person being investigated and then perhaps an innocent person being sent to prison. So my research has looked at forensic science, but has largely focused on eyewitness identification when it comes to harmful evidence, and there's good reason for this. We know that eyewitness identification is very problematic. It's a task that the eyewitnesses find very difficult, and it can lead to lots of errors. And we know from the US, through an organisation you might be familiar with called the Innocence Project, which is an organisation that investigates cases where somebody has already been sent to prison. Very often these are quite old, cold cases that predate modern DNA analysis, but where there's still physical samples from the original crime. So essentially what you can do is reinvestigate the old crime using DNA analysis to determine whether the right person was sent to prison or not. So worryingly, in a piece of research done in 2015 of the first 325 exonerations of the Innocence Project, and to put that in context, those innocent people that have been sent to prison served a mean time in prison of 14 years, with nearly 1 in 5 serving more than 20, and 20 of the people had been sentenced to death. So this is very serious stuff indeed. So we can look at these cold cases and we can analyse what factors are common to them. So what factors led to an innocent person being sent to prison? And although, and you might be surprised at this, the misapplication of forensic science does figure in a large majority. So these are things like microscopic hair comparison, which you often see on CSI programs, which has been largely discontinued now because there's no scientific basis to this at all. It's eyewitness misidentification that seems to be the most prevalent factor, the most harmful form of evidence based on these real cases.
Forensics says one thing, the witness statement another, and after 2 days in the CCTV suite, I'm still nowhere. The evidence we have so far is a dead end, so time to collect some more.
The manuals and codebooks only take you so far and are no match for expertise and a long history of seeing the world as it really is. The case just doesn't smell right, and I trust my nose above all else. Time to start sticking it where the rules say I'm not allowed to go.
So that was again D.I. Bullitt and D.S. Sund. And again, I'm using them to illustrate this very broad, possibly very unfair distinction between the old-fashioned, hunch-based, led-by-the-nose officer and the more contemporary, evidence-based approach to policing. So talking of evidence, there's a great deal of psychological evidence indeed that eyewitness identification and eyewitness memory is very problematic and very likely to lead to errors, which explains why misidentifications are so prevalent in the data that came from the Innocence Project. That research has led to some very clear recommendations being made by the British Psychological Society, American Psychology Law Society and other public agencies. But very few of those recommendations and very few of the results of research has actually been translated through to practice to changing police procedures. Now, you might be tempted to think of this as the D.I. Jake Bullitt effect, that the police just don't want to listen to researchers. But evidence-based policing has gained a lot of traction and been around for quite a while in the UK. And there's a large community of police officers that certainly do engage in research, but we still see this poor translation. So we conducted some research to dig a bit deeper into this by talking through surveys and focus groups to police officers, including those who work in ID suites. And what we found was a fundamental mismatch between the goals of researchers and the goals of practitioners. For one thing, nearly half of all practitioners think that current procedures work very well and don't need improving. But moreover, when you ask them, well, what any improvements should be aimed at, they inevitably say increasing positive identifications, even at the risk of misidentifications, while research tends to be aimed at reducing the rate of misidentifications because we know how difficult eyewitness memory is as a task and we know how error-prone it is. So often what researchers will say to police in this instance is to demonstrate the prevalence of misidentifications and how often an eyewitness will identify the wrong person. But that assumes that police aren't already aware of this. So we did ask them this question. We asked them, how often do you think the person put in a lineup is innocent? So they estimated on average about 1 in 5. 21% of the people who are put in a lineup are probably innocent, which is a startlingly good match indeed for the estimates that have come from research. So it's not as though police are unaware of the dangers of misidentifications. They are. They just still think any changes need to up the rate of positive identifications. And we've got a couple of quotes on the slide here to illustrate some of their thinking around this. They already think the system is too geared up to protect the suspect, that it's too in favour of the defence and not the prosecution. Moreover, they see some of the recommendations being made by researchers an affront to their professionalisation, to their integrity. For instance, one of the key recommendations is that the officer shouldn't know the identity of the suspect in a lineup, which has obviously come from double-blind procedures in medical testing. But when you ask police about this, they see it as an affront to their integrity. They really don't think that they will give off the same non-verbal and other cues that a medical practitioner might. So we see this fundamental mismatch between research and practice. But I think it's safe to say that even if the police adopted every single recommendation made by research, there would still be misidentifications. This is a very difficult task indeed. You're basically asking somebody to recognise an unfamiliar face they saw some time ago for a very brief period of time under very stressful conditions. So there's always going to be misidentifications. So as well as improvements to current procedures, it's also incumbent on researchers to look at alternatives to eyewitness identification. One of the things we've done in research led by my colleague Camilla Elphick and with Graham Hull from the University of Sussex is to look at pupillometry. So measure participants' pupils when they're looking at lineups. The reason for this is that there's evidence that your pupil changes in size with the amount of cognitive load you're experiencing, and your pupils dilate when you see a face that's familiar. So we were thinking maybe it'd be the case that when looking at a lineup, your pupils would change in size, increase in size when you see the perpetrator and not when you're looking at innocent people that you've never seen before. Now, when it came to target absent parades, so those are parades that the perpetrator, someone had seen previously using the crime video, wasn't there, we noticed no reliable differences. But when the perpetrator was present, in a target present parade, we did find very reliable differences. So when looking at the perpetrator, when a witness makes an identification, we saw a large change in the size of their pupil. But we also saw that change when somebody looked at the perpetrator but didn't make an identification. And those changes, the pupil sizes were much greater than when the people were looking at any of the other images. So we could use pupils almost as a check. So if somebody's identified somebody from a lineup and their pupil doesn't change size, maybe that's an indication they're making a misidentification. Inevitably, people always think of CCTV as a possible alternative to eyewitness identification, and it certainly is. What happens in this case is you capture footage or a still from CCTV and compare it to a photo from your suspect. The issue with this is it requires an expert to do that face matching task. It's not something you would just want anyone off the street to do. Because it requires experts, it's not that scalable. You would need a great increase indeed in the number of experts if they were to take up the slack if you stop using eyewitness identification procedure. You would also need to cover every centre, both indoors and outdoors, of the country in CCTV footage, and there's some obvious issues in that. So our PhD student, Ruben Morton, has been looking at the accuracy of expert facial examiners doing this face matching task and ways maybe of improving that accuracy. So indeed, individual examiners tend to be much more accurate than control participants, and the graph in front of you is looking at area under the receiver operating curve. So basically, the higher the score, the better someone is accurately categorizing that face matching task as correctly a match or correctly not a match. But the thing to notice here is the examiner team. When more than one examiner are doing this task, so somebody does the initial decision and it can then be checked, you get very good accuracy. The dot on the far right is how an algorithm, so how, if you give this task to a computer, how it performs. And you can see there, it's performing in a similar way to the average individual examiner, much better than controls, but not as good as the examiner team, well, at least not yet. Ruben also looked at fusing the decision made by the algorithm with that of the human. So this is statistically fusing, don't think of cyborgs for 1 second. And what you find is that because the algorithm tends to find different types of face matching difficult compared to a human, Fusing the algorithm with a human tends to lead to an improvement with identification. And when you fuse them with the team approach to examination, you get very, very good accuracy indeed. Far, far superior to anything you could possibly hope to get from eyewitness identification. However, there is that problem of scalability. The other issue with examiners is that maybe they are as susceptible to potential bias as an eyewitness might be. So this is research conducted by Lee Curley and a team and myself that looked at introducing bias to this face matching task. So you ask people, are these two images the same or not? There's a control group that just does that. Two experimental groups where you either tell them that a super recognizer, somebody very good at recognition, had looked at these two images previously and thought they were a match, or thought they were not a match. What you find is that providing a positive bias augments the existing difference in accuracy, whereby people tend to be better at matches than mismatches. However, when you tell somebody that somebody else had looked at them and thought it was a mismatch, you find that they are not as accurate when it comes to the matches, but become accurate at mismatches. Critically here, we gave everybody a standardized face recognition test, and we found that face recognition ability does not moderate susceptibility to bias. So you were just as likely to be biased if you were very good at recognition than if you're very bad. So this is an indication that even when we're using facial examiners, that they might be susceptible to bias. So care needs to be taken. Another alternative to eyewitness identification is using smartphones, which have become ubiquitous, and using social media.
I've booked some time with our comms team for an appeal through social media. We're going to tweet some images, put the timeline up on the Force Facebook page, and ask for help from the public. We may get some dead-end leads, but I think the public will support what is obviously an important case.
We're asking for help from people who walk along looking at their phone, who would stroll past an alien invasion and not notice until someone put a video on YouTube of a Martian tripping over a kitten. Hashtag, you have to be kidding.
So it hardly comes as a surprise that DI Jake Bullitt is not a fan of using social media to reach out to the community for help in a police investigation. Now, this interaction between community and police is something we've looked at under the lens of citizen forensics, and we have a large cross-disciplinary team between computing and psychology that is currently supported by an EPSRC grant. One of the first things we did was to develop a typology of citizen forensics based on Hackley's 2013 citizen science typology. This ranges from the lowest level of citizen involvement, level 1, which is basically crowdsourcing. This is using citizen community almost like a sensor. For instance, in the missing person case, you could ask, has anybody seen this person? Through to the other end, where the citizens and community can be far more involved in the inquiry and indeed conduct their own investigation, setting questions, using their own methods to find answers. And it's this last level, level 4, that I want to look at today, though we've been looking at all elements of that typology in our research. So this is where citizens perform their own investigations. So this includes web sleuths. One of the reasons I want to talk about this is I find it a particularly interesting thing, and I know it's relevant to police agencies, because as part of this research, we've been talking to a number of police forces around the country, particularly Thames Valley and Greater Manchester, who reported a particular problem to us, which was people reporting crimes having already solved them themselves. So, for example, somebody might have seen a theft or a fight at a party, shows up at a police station to report it, having investigated the crime online and through social media, and turns up with a photograph of the person and their location. The issue then is the police can't simply take that evidence and run with it and present it through to the Criminal Prosecution Service. Instead, they have to conduct their own investigation. So at this point, there are two possibly conflicting investigations going on. The one initially done by the web sleuth, but then the formal investigation done by the police in which the web sleuth is a witness. So for example, the witness might be asked to attend an eyewitness identification procedure to identify a potential perpetrator. But at that point, there's a problem, because who are they identifying? Are they identifying the person they saw originally, or has their memory become very much changed and adapted for all the web sleuthing and photos online that they've been looking? So to look at this, our initial thought was to use existing social media sites such as Facebook and Twitter and Reddit. But we very quickly realized we couldn't do that for privacy, security and ethical reasons. So instead, we created our very own social media site, FriendFace. I'm very grateful indeed to the work of the team in doing this, particularly to Elsa Strathy and Trina Havard. So you can see some screenshots of our social media site in front of you. And you can see it does look like most social media sites. So the image on the left is a page set up for a particular event at Community Centre, showing photos people took and uploaded of that event and the guest list of the people who said they were going to attend or maybe attend. And then from that guest list, anybody listed on it also has their own profile page containing more information about themselves and more photos of themselves. So what we did was to show participants, research participants, a video of a staged crime. And we then let 2/3 of them loose on FriendFace to try to solve it before then getting everybody back to do a lineup. So that middle condition of using FriendFace to be a web sleuth had a control in which people didn't see the social media site at all. A condition in which one of the profiles was indeed of the perpetrator from the crime video, and an alternative condition in which that person's profile had been removed and replaced with a lookalike. So there we can see what happens if people see the perpetrator, but also don't find the perpetrator, find a potentially innocent suspect. They then looked at either a target present parade that had the face of the original perpetrator in, or a target absent parade that had the picture of the lookalike. And this was a fully crossed design. So initially we did this as a lab-based study, and we found nothing in the target present conditions at all. But in the target absent condition, what we found is that seeing the lookalike meant that people's identifications were very similar to the control, that being exposed to social media and being a web sleuth really didn't seem to have an effect. However, when they saw the culprit, the person they'd seen in the video on social media, it meant that they made more accurate decisions at target absent parades. So because almost they'd been looking at all of these faces and hadn't seen the face of they had seen the face of the culprit, kind of reinforced their memory, and they were more able to correctly reject a lineup that didn't have that person in. Typically, we then redid this study online and found something quite different. This time, no difference in target absent, but we did find a target present effect. And here, what we found was that where people were web sleuths and didn't see the culprit, but did see the lookalike, their accuracy at target present parades was nothing like as good as the control or culprit conditions. So they were far more likely to make either a misidentification or an incorrect rejection of the parade, saying the person wasn't present, than they were a correct identification. So here we can see quite a complex picture emerging from using social media. In one of our experiments, it almost had a protective effect if the police had got the wrong person. In the second online one, we found that seeing the wrong person did lead to poorer performance at lineups. So in summary, and concluding a talk on harmful evidence and evidence in harm in the criminal justice system, I hope you'd agree with me that a multidisciplinary approach does provide some useful new insights and approaches to psychological issues. Recontextualizing the criminal justice process in terms of harm particularly identifies some new problems and new research questions and potentially new solutions for law enforcement. I think it's clear we need to do something to address the health and well-being of emergency responders, including the police. And indeed, I know police agencies and other emergency responder agencies see this as a priority and are doing a lot of work now to support their personnel. It's also the case that new technologies can offer potential solutions to avoid the harmful evidence that's produced from eyewitness misidentifications. But great care needs to be taken when using these techniques if you're not simply going to replicate old problems such as bias. Thank you very much.